They called it the language of creation, though no one truly remembered why. In the earliest epochs of the Empire, before its dominion stretched across galaxies, before it bent stars into weapons and stitched wormholes into roads, the code had been understood. Or so the oldest records claimed. Back then, the architects, the ones the Empire now worshipped as gods, had written reality itself in lines of impossible syntax. But that knowledge was long gone. What remained were fragments, monuments, echoes, towering black pillars carved with shifting symbols no living mind could interpret, star systems arranged in precise, unnatural geometries, machines that worked flawlessly but could not be repaired, modified, or even fully observed without triggering cascading anomalies. The code was sacred, and it was failing. Entire sectors had begun to decay, planets drifting out of orbit, suns dimming without cause, gateways collapsing mid-transit. The Empire, for all its power, could only maintain what already existed. It could not create any more. Not like the gods once had. So when a forgotten archive ship, drifting at the edge of a quarantine system, transmitted something unusual, they paid attention. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a relic. It was a life form. Human. The classification alone sparked debate among the high executors. Humanity had been catalogued and largely erased centuries ago, a species deemed insignificant, volatile, and biologically inefficient. A footnote in the Empire's expansion. And yet, this one had survived. Recovered from a sealed cryogenic chamber, the human appeared unremarkable. Average height. Weak skeletal structure. Limited neural capacity compared to even the Empire's lowest citizen caste. He should have been irrelevant. But the ship's logs told a different story. He had been preserved not as cargo, but as a specialist. The translation of the ancient logs took weeks. When it was complete, the message spread through the highest ranks like a fracture through glass. Subject demonstrates advanced capability in symbolic systems, recursive structures, and abstract language manipulation. In simpler terms, he could read code. The Empire didn't hesitate. He was transported under maximum containment to the Citadel of Syntax, the oldest and most forbidden site in the Imperial core. It was there that the largest surviving fragments of the God Code still pulsed, embedded in reality itself. No one entered the Citadel without consequence. Even the priests, who had dedicated their existence to interpreting its patterns, spoke of it in reverent fear. The human arrived in chains. Not because he resisted, because they didn't understand him. He woke slowly during transit, disoriented but observant. His eyes tracked everything. The walls, the guards, the faint distortions in space where the code bled through the structure of the ship. "Where am I?" he asked once. No one answered. By the time they reached the Citadel, word had already spread. The High Executor himself came to witness. The chamber of entry was vast, its ceiling lost in a darkness that shimmered with faint symbols, like constellations written in a language no one could speak. At its center stood one of the pillars, a monolithic structure of obsidian-like material, covered in glowing glyphs that shifted and rearranged themselves in impossible patterns. Even looking at it too long could fracture the mind. The human squinted at it. That was the first sign something was wrong. "Remove the restraints," the executor ordered. There was hesitation. Now. The chains fell away. The human rubbed his wrists, then looked around, taking in the chamber with quiet curiosity rather than awe. "You understand why you are here?" the executor asked. "No," the human said plainly. A ripple of unease passed through the gathered priests. The executor gestured toward the pillar. "This is the foundation of our existence. The divine structure upon which reality is built. It is deteriorating." The human stepped closer. The air warped subtly around him as he approached the code. The glyphs reacted, not violently but noticeably, shifting faster, like something becoming aware. No one else had ever caused that. "Read it," the executor commanded. Silence fell. Even the ever-present hum of the Citadel seemed to pause. The human stared at the pillar. Seconds passed. Then minutes. His expression changed, not to fear, not to reverence, but to something far more unsettling. Confusion. Then disbelief. Wait, he said under his breath. He stepped even closer, ignoring the warnings shouted by the priests. One of them tried to pull him back, but the executor raised a hand. Let him continue. The human lifted a hand, hesitating for just a moment before brushing his fingers near the surface of the pillar. The glyphs surged. Light cascaded across the chamber. Several priests staggered, clutching their heads as fragments of incomprehensible meaning flooded their senses. The human flinched, but didn't collapse. Instead, he leaned in. Reading. Processing. Understanding. After a long moment, he exhaled slowly. Oh, he said. The executor stepped forward. You comprehend it? The human turned, looking at him, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to amusement. This isn't divine. A shockwave of outrage rippled through the chamber. Careful, creature, one of the priests hissed. But the human shook his head, almost laughing. No, I mean, look at this. He gestured back at the pillar. The structure's a mess. There's no consistency in syntax, half the logic loops are redundant, and, wait, is that a recursive call with no termination condition? No one understood his words, but they understood his tone. The executor's voice hardened. Explain yourself. The human looked back at the code, then at the gathered figures who ruled galaxies. And for the first time, he smiled. It's not a god language, he said. It's just badly written code. They should have executed him immediately. Several priests demanded it. Blasphemy was not a crime in the Empire, it was an error condition, something to be erased before it could propagate. And this human, this insignificant relic of a dead species, had not only questioned the sanctity of the God Code. He had dismissed it. But the High Executor did not give the order. Because for the first time in centuries, something impossible had happened inside the citadel of syntax. The code had reacted. Not passively, as it always did when observed. Not violently, as it did when disturbed. But responsively, as if it had been read. The human stood at the base of the pillar, still studying the shifting glyphs with an intensity that bordered on fascination. The priests watched from a distance, whispering in agitation, while execution drones hovered silently overhead, armed, waiting. You claim it is flawed, the executor said at last. The human glanced over his shoulder. Not flawed. Broken. There's a difference. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The executor stepped closer, his voice low and controlled. And you believe you can repair what our gods created? The human shrugged. I don't know yet. But I know this much, whatever built this. He nodded toward the pillar. They didn't expect anyone to maintain it long term. It's all shortcuts and patchwork. It probably worked fine at first, but over time, he gestured vaguely. Stuff like this always collapses. Stuff like this governs reality, a priest snapped. Yeah, the human said. That's kind of the problem. The executor studied him carefully. You will demonstrate. The chamber stilled. One of the priests stepped forward sharply. Executor, no, tampering with the code is forbidden. The last time, the executor interrupted, we did not have this. He gestured toward the human. A long silence followed. What do you require? The executor asked. The human blinked, surprised. Seriously? You will be given controlled access, the executor continued. Limited scope. Full containment. You will attempt a correction. And if I refuse? The drones shifted, their weapons humming softly. The human exhaled. Yeah. Thought so. He looked back at the pillar, squinting again as the glyphs flowed across its surface. I need an interface, he said. The priests exchanged confused looks. Clarify, the executor demanded. A way to interact with it. Directly editing raw structure like this is risky. He hesitated, then added, and inefficient. This is the interface, one priest said, gesturing at the pillar. The human winced. That's not an interface. That's like trying to rewrite a program by staring at the electricity in the wires. The room fell silent. I need something simpler, he continued. A controlled layer. Input. Output. Edit permissions. Even a basic terminal would help. The priests recoiled at the unfamiliar terminology. But the executor only nodded. Construct it. It took 3 cycles. The Empire's finest machine oracles, guided by the humans' increasingly specific and increasingly strange instructions, assembled what he described as a sandboxed editing environment. To them, it looked like heresy made manifest. A floating console of light and shifting geometry appeared before the pillar, a translation layer between mortal interaction and divine structure. Every connection was restricted. Every change would be isolated, monitored, and, if necessary, instantly reversed. The humans stared at it. Okay, he said slowly. That'll work. Chains were reattached, not around his wrist this time, but encoded into the system itself. Failsafes, kill switches, containment protocols that could erase him from existence if anything went wrong. Proceed, the executor commanded. The human stepped forward. For a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something else. Focus. Then he reached out. The interface responded instantly, its alien geometry reshaping into something simpler, cleaner. The Empire's observers didn't understand what they were seeing, but the human did. Structured, ordered, legible. Wow, he whispered. This is worse than I thought. Lines of code unfolded before him, ancient, vast, and impossibly complex. Entire sections pulsed with instability, logic chains looping endlessly, functions referencing entities that no longer existed. Okay, he murmured. Don't panic. Start small. Report your actions, the executor said sharply. Yeah. The human scanned the structure, eyes moving rapidly. There's a stabilization routine here, controls localized gravitational constants in this region. He frowned. It's duplicated, multiple times. And they're all slightly different. Can it be corrected? The executor asked. Yeah. Easily. The priests tensed. Do not act without authorization, one warned. The human glanced at them. You just authorized me. The pause. Then the executor nodded once. Proceed. The human exhaled. All right. First fix. He reached into the code. Selected a single line. Deleted it. Then rewrote it. For a fraction of a second. Reality broke. The chamber inverted. Gravity flipped violently, hurling several priests toward the ceiling before snapping back. Time fragmented into overlapping echoes, movements repeating, voices doubling, shadows lagging behind their owners. One of the drones emitted a distorted shriek before collapsing inward, its structure folding into nothing. Everything stopped. Silence. Stillness. The code stabilized. The pillar's glow shifted subtly, its chaotic flickering smoothing into something cleaner. The human froze, staring at what he had done. Okay, he said quietly. That worked. Around him, the chamber was in disarray. Several priests lay unconscious. The remaining drones recalibrated, weapons locking onto him instantly. Contain him, one of the priests shouted. But the executor raised a hand. Hold. His gaze was fixed on the pillar. The change was undeniable. For the first time in recorded history, the code had been altered, and it had not collapsed. The executor turned slowly toward the human. What did you do? The human swallowed, then let out a shaky breath. I removed a redundant loop, he said, and fixed the logic so it actually terminates. No one understood the words, but they understood the result. The impossible had just become possible. The human looked back at the interface, eyes wide, not with fear, but with excitement. A slow grin spread across his face. Oh, he said. Oh, I can definitely fix this. They didn't celebrate. They didn't thank him. They didn't even pretend to understand what he had done. The moment the code stabilized, the Empire made its decision. The human would never leave the Citadel. The chamber was rebuilt within days. Damaged drones were replaced. The unconscious priests either recovered or were quietly removed. The pillar remained, but now it pulsed with a slightly different rhythm. Subtle, cleaner, almost obedient. And at its center stood the human's interface. No longer temporary. Now permanent. But so were the restrictions. He was moved to a sealed containment ring deep within the citadel, a circular chamber wrapped in layers of shifting code, constantly rewriting itself to prevent escape. There were no doors, no windows, only a controlled projection of the pillar and his editing terminal. The Empire didn't trust him. They feared him. So they did what they did best. They turned him into a tool. You will not act without command. The High Executor's voice echoed through the chamber as the restraints activated, no longer physical chains, but embedded protocols tied directly into the code itself. If you attempt unauthorized changes, you will be terminated. The human sat in front of the interface, expression neutral. Yeah, he said. I figured. You will not speak unless addressed. Got it? You will not attempt to access restricted layers of the code. The human paused at that. Define restricted. The room went silent. All layers beyond your assigned scope, the executor replied. The human smirked faintly. So, the interesting parts. A drone shifted closer. The executor ignored the comment. You will perform corrections as instructed. Nothing more. The beat. Understood, the executor asked. The human leaned back in his chair, staring at the glowing lattice of code in front of him. Yeah, he said quietly. Understood. At first, they tested him cautiously. Small tasks. Localized anomalies. A failing atmospheric regulator on a mining world. A gravitational instability near a border system. Each time, the process was the same. He would analyze. He would mutter things no one understood. Then he would rewrite. And every time, it worked. Faster than the priests. Cleaner than the machine oracles. Permanent. Weeks passed. The months. The scope of his assignments expanded. Dead stars reignited. Collapsed wormholes reopened. Ancient warships, long considered irreparable, returned to full function with a few precise edits. The Empire entered a new era of dominance. And at the center of it all was a single human. But they never loosened his leash. His access remained limited, sections of the code carefully isolated, fed to him piece by piece. He was never allowed to see the full structure. Never allowed to explore freely. They monitored everything. Every keystroke. Every pause. Every breath. The chamber was silent except for the faint hum of the interface and the occasional voice of an overseer issuing commands. You will stabilize Sector 19B. You will repair the transit lattice. You will optimize fleet response time. He obeyed. Boys. But something began to change. Not in the Empire. In the code. It started small. Almost invisible. A guard stationed outside the containment ring reported a malfunction. His weapon failed to activate during a routine check. Diagnostics showed no error. It simply didn't fire. The incident was dismissed. Then a door in a restricted corridor opened half a second before authorization was granted. A timing glitch, they said. Then a surveillance feed looped. 3 seconds of footage repeating endlessly before correcting itself. Unusual, but harmless. The priests grew uneasy. These are not natural degradations, one of them insisted during a council session. The code is shifting. The executor's gaze hardened. Is it destabilizing? No, the priest admitted. That is what concerns us. The anomalies are precise. Inside the containment ring, the human kept working. He rarely spoke anymore. Didn't need to. His hands moved across the interface with quiet efficiency, eyes scanning lines of ancient structure that no one else could comprehend. But sometimes, he paused. Not because he was confused, because he was thinking. Task complete, he said one cycle, leaning back slightly. The overseer's voice responded instantly. Confirmed. The pause. You ever notice, the human said casually, how your system permissions are structured? Silence. That is not relevant to your task, the overseer replied. Yeah, I know, the human said. Just interesting. No further response came. But the human smiled faintly. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't realize, was that he wasn't just fixing the code anymore. He was learning it, all of it. Every fragment they gave him, every system they exposed, every limitation they tried to enforce. To the Empire, the code was divine, immutable, beyond comprehension. But to him, it was just a system. And every system had patterns. One cycle, while correcting a minor energy distribution fault, he noticed something. A deeper layer beneath the assigned structure. Hidden. Not restricted, just overlooked. A legacy function. Unused. Unmonitored. The kind of thing developers forgot about. The kind of thing that shouldn't matter. He stared at it for a long moment. Very carefully, he added a single line. Not a command. Not a change to functionality. Just a condition. Harmless. Invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The system didn't react. No alarms. No distortion. Nothing. Task complete, he said. Confirmed, the overseer replied. The human leaned back, staring at the code as it flowed around him. For the first time since his capture, he wasn't just surviving. He was building. Slowly. Quietly. Piece by piece. Across the Empire, the glitches continued. Precise. Untraceable. And deep within the God code, something new had begun to take shape. Not imposed. Not commanded. But written. The human never stopped typing. By the 7th year, the Empire stopped questioning the miracles. They had grown used to them. Worlds that once teetered on collapse now ran with flawless precision. Energy flowed without loss. Fleets responded before commands were fully issued. Entire regions of space operated with an efficiency that exceeded even the oldest records of the gods. The priests called it restoration. The executor called it control. The human called it nothing at all. He just kept working. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. At first, it existed only in fragments. Tiny insertions buried deep inside routine fixes. A conditional here. A silent override there. Not enough to trigger alarms. Not enough to alter behavior in any noticeable way. Just adjustments. Invisible scaffolding. The Empire's monitoring systems saw everything. Except intent. And intent was where the human lived. Optimize fleet response latency, the overseer instructed. The human nodded slightly, eyes already scanning the relevant structures. Yeah, your problem isn't speed, he muttered. It's prioritization logic. He reached into the code, unraveling a tangled sequence of command hierarchies. Too many layers, he said softly. Too many permissions stacked on top of each other. He paused. Then added a line. Not part of the optimization. Something else. Something deeper. Across the fleet, response times improved instantly. Orders executed with near zero delay. The overseer confirmed success. The priests recorded another restoration event. No one noticed the additional change. The human leaned back, staring at the glowing lattice. Permissions, he whispered. The concept fascinated him. Not the Empire's version of it, rigid, hierarchical, absolute. But the underlying structure. The way the code itself determined who could do what. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. The Empire didn't truly control the code. They interfaced with it, relied on it, worshipped it. But the authority they believed they had was just another layer. And layers could be rewritten. It took time. Patience. Every modification had to be indistinguishable from maintenance. Every insertion had to serve two purposes, one visible, one hidden. He couldn't rush, because if they noticed, he wouldn't get a second chance. Years passed. The hidden layer grew. It wasn't a program. Not exactly. It had no central function. No obvious structure. It was distributed, woven through thousands of systems, embedded inside legitimate corrections, masked as efficiency improvements and logical cleanups. Each piece alone meant nothing. Together, they formed something new. The priests began to feel it. Not see it. Not detect it. Feel it. The code is different, one of them said during a closed council session. The chamber was dim, lit only by the faint ambient glow of distant structures. Different how? The executor asked. The priest hesitated. Cleaner. Silence. That is the human's purpose, the executor replied. No, the priest said slowly. Not cleaner in function. Cleaner in intent. The executor's gaze sharpened. Clarify. I cannot, the priest admitted. It is beyond interpretation. But the patterns, they are becoming more consistent. More logical. The pause. Less divine. The word hung in the air like a fracture. Inside the containment ring, the human stopped typing. Just for a moment. He looked up at the flowing structure of the code, watching as countless systems updated, synchronized, and stabilized in real time. He could feel it now. Not physically, but conceptually. The way a programmer feels a system after working on it long enough. It was changing. Because of him. Task complete, he said. Confirmed, the overseer replied. The beat. Proceed to next assignment. He didn't move. You ever think about who wrote this? He asked. Silence. That is not relevant, the overseer said. The human smiled faintly. Yeah, he said. That's what I thought. He turned back to the interface. And this time, he didn't wait for permission. The change was small. So small it didn't even register as a modification. A definition. One word. Buried deep inside a core structure the Empire had never accessed directly. Authority. Originally, it referenced a fixed hierarchy, ancient, absolute, unchangeable. The humans studied it for a long moment. Then rewrote it. Not completely. Just enough. Authority equals verified input source. The system accepted the change without resistance. No alarms. No distortion. Because technically, nothing had broken. But everything had shifted. Now, authority was no longer tied to the Empire. Not directly. It was tied to input. An input could be redefined. The human exhaled slowly. Okay, he whispered. Now we're getting somewhere. From that moment on, the hidden layer evolved. Faster. Bolder. He began linking fragments together. Connecting previously isolated insertions into a coherent structure. A framework. A new foundation running beneath the old one. At its core was a simple rule. Elegant. Invisible. Unquestioned. All systems must accept input from authorized user. At first, the authorized user field was empty. A placeholder. Harmless. Then one cycle. He filled it. Authorized user. Human. The code paused. Just for a fraction of a second. Not enough for the Empire to notice. But enough for him to feel it. Acceptance. The system didn't reject the command. Didn't question it. Because from its perspective, it was valid. The human leaned back, heart beating just a little faster. Huh, he said softly. Across the Empire, nothing changed. Not yet. The fleets still obeyed. The cities still functioned. The priests still believed. But deep within the God code, authority had already shifted. And no one knew. Except the one person they had enslaved to fix it. The human looked at the interface, a slow, quiet smile forming. Yeah, he whispered. You really should have read your own system. It didn't happen all at once. There was no explosion. No warning. No dramatic collapse of the Empire's vast dominion. It began quietly. A command failed. Not in a distant system. Not at the edge of controlled space. But at the very center of the Empire. Deploy Fleet Formation Delta. The order was issued by the High Executor himself, standing within the Citadel's command chamber. The response came instantly. Command rejected. Silence followed. The Executor frowned. Repeat. Deploy Fleet Formation Delta. The pause. Command rejected. The chamber shifted uneasily. That is not possible, one of the overseers said. Override, the Executor snapped. Override denied. A flicker of something unfamiliar passed through the room. Not confusion. Not yet. Something closer to uncertainty. Across the Empire, similar anomalies began to surface. Weapons systems refusing to activate. Containment fields disengaging without authorization. Navigation networks rerouting themselves. Subtly, precisely, as if following instructions no one had given. The priests scrambled to interpret. The machine oracles searched for faults. There were none. Inside the containment ring, the humans sat still. Hands resting lightly on the interface. Not typing. Not moving. Just watching. You will report immediately, the overseer's voice demanded. No response. Human. This is a direct command. The human exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said. I know. For the first time since his capture, he stood up. The restraints didn't activate. That was the first real sign. Not the failing commands. Not the rejected overrides. But that the system that had been designed to control him did nothing. The human glanced at his wrists. Then at the interface. Right, he said softly. He took a step forward. Beyond the containment ring, alarms began to rise. Not chaotic. Not panicked. But controlled. System-level alerts cascading through layers of infrastructure. Permission conflict detected. Authority structure updating. What is happening? A priest demanded. No source identified, an oracle replied. The code is rewriting. The high executor turned sharply. Bring the human. The command was issued. The system processed it. Command rejected. Silence. For the first time in recorded history, the Empire had given an order, and reality had said no. Inside the containment chamber, the human began walking. The boundary that had once been an impenetrable barrier flickered, then dissolved, like it had never existed. He stepped out. No drones fired. No alarms targeted him. No systems reacted at all. Because of the code. He wasn't a prisoner. He was the highest authority. The citadel trembled as he entered the central chamber. Not violently. Not destructively. But responsively. Like a system recognizing a new administrator. The high executor stood at the base of the pillar, surrounded by priests and drones. For the first time, they looked uncertain. You, the executor said, voice low and sharp. What have you done? The human stopped a few steps away. He looked different. Not physically, but in presence. Certain. I fixed it, he said. The executor's expression darkened. You altered the code beyond your authorization. The human tilted his head slightly. Authorization. He gestured toward the pillar. The code flowed smoothly now, clean, structured, stable in a way it had never been before. You were never actually controlling this, he continued. You were just using it, like an interface you didn't understand. Silence, a priest hissed. The executor raised a hand, stopping him. His gaze never left the human. Restore the previous state, he ordered. The human smiled faintly. I can't. A pulse of tension rippled through the chamber. You will, the executor said. The human shook his head. No, he said. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore. He stepped closer to the pillar. The drones tracked him, but didn't fire. You built your entire empire on this system, he said quietly. But you never read it. Never understood it. You just assumed, because it worked, it was yours. The executor drew his weapon. A blade of condensed stellar energy ignited in his hand. You will comply, he said. The human glanced at it. The weapon flickered. Dissolved. Unraveling into particles of light that drifted harmlessly to the floor. The chamber froze. Across the Empire, everything began to change. Ships powered down mid-flight. Weapons systems locked themselves. Prisons opened. Barriers fell. Chains, physical and digital, released in perfect synchronization. System update in progress. Redefining authority. The priests staggered as the code surged around them, no longer chaotic, but purposeful. You're not destroying it, the executor said, realization creeping into his voice. The human shook his head. No, he said softly. I'm cleaning it. He reached out and touched the pillar. The code responded instantly. Not violently. Not unpredictably. But willingly. Your problem wasn't power, he continued. It was structure. The chamber warped, not breaking, but updating. Layers of reality rewriting themselves in real time. You built hierarchies on top of something that didn't need them. Removing redundant permissions. You called it divine because you couldn't understand it. Optimizing system logic, but it's not divine. Applying final patch. It's just code. The human looked back at the executor. And now, he said quietly, // system ownership transfer complete. Silence. The pillar's light stabilized into a steady, perfect glow. Across the empire, the changes settled. No more rejected commands. No more failing systems. No more instability. But one thing had fundamentally changed. The empire no longer controlled reality. The code did not recognize them anymore. Only one authority remained. The human stepped back, exhaling slowly. For the first time since his capture, there were no restraints, no commands, no watchers, just silence. The High Executor stood motionless, powerless. You were never gods, the human said. The words weren't cruel. They weren't angry. They were simply true. You just inherited bad code. He turned away from the pillar. Behind him, the citadel continued to hum. But now it sounded different, cleaner. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the system was finally stable.